Let me introduce you very quickly to the classical writer Longinus, and then in future videos we'll zoom in and talk about specific aspects of his work on the Sublime. So as you may have heard, his name is pronounced Longinus, and for a long time I used to say Longinus, but I gather that's actually incorrect, so Longinus. Now, Longinus is a figure that we don't know very much about, so we have very few biographical details, and those can be summed up quite quickly. First of all, he was likely writing in the 1st century AD. So 1st century AD, okay. And we know that his work is addressed to a Roman figure whose name is Terentianus Postumius, quite the name, Postumius. But we don't know very much about this figure either. He may have been some kind of Roman official, and that's about all that we're aware of. About Longinus, we gather that he may have had some Jewish connections, so perhaps he was a Hellenic Jew, and Hellenic refers here to his Greek nature, so a Hellenic Jew, but we do have to put a question mark behind that because this is mostly just a kind of surmise. We have two pieces of evidence for this, the fact that he might have been a Hellenic Jew. First of all, the Jewish part comes from the fact that he does refer to the Bible at times, the Old Testament especially, and he talks, for instance, about Genesis. He talks about how sublime it is, how amazing it is when God creates the universe with his words. The other part of this identity, the Hellenic part, may be evident from the fact that sometimes Longinus refers to our author when he's talking about people like Homer, for instance. So by saying that to the Roman Terentianus, he's kind of saying, well, this is our author, and that suggests that he has some kind of Greek background. In any case, Longinus is very well read, and he refers to many different authors throughout his work. Now, when you read Longinus, you'll find that he's quite different from writers like Plato and Aristotle. Those authors are often concerned with very big questions of education, for instance, and is poetry a good thing for the Republic? Longinus very much zooms into one issue, and that issue is what makes writing great, right? What do we look for in writing, and what makes us read great works of literature to get a certain feeling? What is that feeling? So he calls this the Sublime, and he treats it mostly as a literary phenomenon. So he writes, the Sublime, wherever it occurs, consists in a certain loftiness and excellence of language. In other words, he's primarily focused on language and not so much on other forms of art, painting and sculpture and things like that. Although I'm sure he wouldn't exclude those either, but his focus is very specific here. I'm not going to go into all kinds of details here in terms of what he touches on, but I'd like to summarize just a few critical things that Longinus achieves in his work. The first thing is when he talks about the Sublime, he often compares it to a lightning bolt. Okay, so a lightning bolt. And he does that to stress the uniqueness of this experience. It's a psychological moment where some amazing piece of writing hits you, or it hits the speaker who is passionate in the text, and the sublime passion just pours out. So it's very much like a lightning bolt. And at one point he contrasts this with rhetoric, so we can write that this is different from rhetoric. Okay, different from rhetoric, even though rhetoric and sublime language often use the same poetic figures, the same metaphors and so on. But this is different from rhetoric because, first of all, rhetoric is often premeditated, so you kind of plan what you're going to say to persuade somebody, and as a result it's not spoken as much in the moment, right, as a kind of passionate outpouring. And the other thing is that rhetoric is often not as fast, not as quick. It builds things up slowly in some kind of slow crescendo. And Longinus actually compares this to a kind of slow moving fire that comes at you. You can see it from miles away. But the Sublime is much more like a lightning bolt. Couple more things here. Longinus does not create a clear distinction, so no clear separation between beauty and the sublime. Okay, between beauty and the sublime. And that's important because later writers, especially Edmund Burke, whom we'll cover in a different series, really start to create this separation, that these two things are not the same. Longinus doesn't do that, and I think that's interesting, that the sublime is quite a wide concept that can apply to many different things. And then the last critical thing about his work, as we try to summarize very broadly what he's trying to do, is that for him, yes, you can identify some of the features of the sublime, and we'll get to that, but in the end, it's ultimately about passion. Okay, so passion is the critical ingredient. Without it, your writing is going to be stiff or cold, overly ornate, all kinds of problems that we can identify. We absolutely need passion to get to the sublime. The last thing I'll mention here is that this work became very influential, but largely after the Middle Ages, when it was rediscovered in the Renaissance. And there are three figures that I'll mention in passing here. So first of all, Nicolas Boileau, the French critic, translated the text into French in 1674. Okay, 1674, which really made it accessible to a larger European public. Then we have Edmund Burke writing in 1757 in a text that's called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. And Burke really created that separation, as mentioned, between the sublime and the beautiful. And he was also very influential in relation to the Romantics, who read him extensively and whose poetry is above all an attempt to experience and express the sublime. And then the last figure I'll mention here is Emmanuel Kant, the German philosopher, and he was writing about the sublime a number of times in his life, but particularly in 1764 and 1790. Okay. And I won't deal with him so much in these lectures on the sublime, but he tries to look at it also from a philosophical point of view. How does this happen psychologically? How does the mind deal with the outside world and the way it stimulates particular experiences? Hopefully that gets you interested in the subject, and in our next lecture we'll talk a little bit about the structure of Longinus's On the Sublime.